Chapter 5. As the days passed, Mary Ellen settled down to life at Jamaica and with a sense of determination. It was clear that she could not leave her aunt to face the winter alone. She must make the best of the 6 months that lay ahead. If possible, she was determined to defeat her uncle and deliver him and his companions to the law. The events of that first Saturday night were never far from her mind, and the meaning of the rope's end hanging from the beam was clear. Mary had no doubt that the stranger had been killed by her uncle and another man, and his body buried somewhere on the moors. There was nothing to prove it, though, and in the light of day, the story seemed unlikely. 2 weeks went by, and there was no Saturday night like the first one. No one came to the inn. The future seemed very black at times, especially as Aunt Patience made little effort to be a close companion, and though now and again she took hold of Mary's hand, telling her how glad she was to have her in the house, most of the time the poor woman existed in a dream, going about her duties without thinking and rarely speaking. One morning Mary decided to clean down the long stone passage that ran the full width of the back of the house. As she was doing this, she heard the sound of a horse in the yard, and a moment later, someone thundered on the closed door of the bar. No one had come near Jamaica Inn before, and this knock on the door was an unusual event. Mary wiped her hands and went into the bar. A man was sitting there, with a glass in his hand, which he had calmly filled for himself. For a few minutes, they considered each other in silence. Something about him was familiar, and Mary wondered where she had seen him before. The heavy eyes, the curve of his mouth, and the shape of his jaw, even the look which he gave her, were known to her and disliked. The sight of him examining her and drinking at the same time made her angry. "What do you think you're doing?" she said. "You haven't any right to walk in here and help yourself." The man finished his drink, and held out his glass to be refilled. "Since when have they kept a bar girl at Jamaica Inn?" he asked her, and, feeling in his pocket for a pipe, he lit it, blowing a great cloud of smoke in her face. His manner angered Mary even more, and she leaned forward and pulled the pipe out of his hand, throwing it behind her onto the floor, where it broke. "Is this how they train you to serve your customers?" "I don't think much of their choice." "Fill up my glass." "That's what you're here for, isn't it?" he said. "As you seem to know your way about here, you can fill your own glass." "I'll tell Mr. Merlin you're in the bar, and he can serve you himself if he likes." "Oh, don't worry, Joss." "What's happened to his wife? Has he sent her away to make room for you?" "I call that unkind to the poor woman. Do you want to speak to the landlord or not?" "I can't stand here all day." "If you don't want to see him, and you have finished your drink, You can put your money on the table and leave. The man laughed. Do you give orders to Joss in that way? He said. He must be a changed man if you do. Joss Merlin is my uncle by marriage, she said. My name is Mary Ellen, if that means anything to you. There's the door behind you. Good morning. She left the bar, meeting the landlord himself in the doorway. Oh, it's you, Jem, is it? What do you want at Jamaica Inn? He closed the door behind him, leaving Mary in the passage outside. She went back to her bucket of water. So that was Jem Merlin, her uncle's younger brother. Of course, he had reminded her of her uncle all through the conversation, though she had not realized it. He had Joss Merlin's eyes, without the lines round them, and he had Joss Merlin's mouth, firm, though, where the landlord's was weak. He was what Joss Merlin might have been 18 or 20 years ago, but smaller and neater. This Jem had the same cruelty in him as his brother, she could see it in the shape of his mouth. And Patience had said he was the worst of the family. She was so busy that she did not hear the stones thrown at the window of the room, and it was not until one cracked the glass that, looking out of the window, she saw Jem Merlin standing in the yard beside his horse. Mary unlocked the heavy entrance door and went out. What do you want now? She asked him. Forgive me if I was rude to you just now, he said. Somehow I didn't expect to see a woman at Jamaica Inn, well, not a young girl like you. I know I deserve black looks for behaving as I did, but if you knew my brother as well as I do you'd understand how I made the mistake. It looks strange, having a girl at Jamaica Inn. Why did you come here in the first place? He looked serious now, and his likeness to Joss had gone for the moment. She wished he were not a Merlin. I came here to be with my Aunt Patience, she said. My mother died some weeks ago, and I have no other relative. I'll tell you one thing, Mr. Merlin, I am thankful my mother isn't alive to see her sister now. You haven't a good opinion of the landlord, then? No, I have not, she replied. He's turned my aunt from a laughing, happy woman into a miserable slave, and I'll never forgive him for that as long as I live. We Merlins have never been good to our women. I can remember my father beating my mother until she couldn't stand. She never left him, though. When he was hanged at Exeter, she never spoke a word for 3 months. Her hair went white with the shock. What she found to love in him, I can't say. He never asked for her after he'd been taken, and he left all his money to another woman on the other side of the river. Mary was silent. The lack of feeling in his voice shocked her. He spoke without shame or sorrow, and she supposed that he had been born, like the rest of his family, without any warmth or gentleness. "How long do you mean to stay at Jamaica Inn?" he asked suddenly. "There's not much company for you here. I'm not going away unless I take my aunt with me. I'd never leave her alone, after what I have seen. What have you learned, in your short time?" "It's quiet enough here." Mary thought that he might be trying to make her talk. It was possible that her uncle had suggested that his brother should speak to her, hoping in this way to obtain information. "I helped my uncle in the bar one Saturday night, and I didn't care for the company he kept." "I don't suppose you did." "The men who come to Jamaica and have never been taught manners. They spend too much time in prison." "What do you do for a living?" asked Mary with sudden interest, for he spoke better than his brother. "I'm a horse thief," he said cheerfully, "but there's not much money in it, really. My pockets are always empty." "Aren't you afraid of being caught?" said Mary. "Stealing is an awkward thing to prove. Suppose a horse wanders away and his owner goes to look for him. These moors are full of wild horses and cattle. It's not going to be easy to find his horse. Say the horse had long hair, and one white foot, and a diamond mark in his ear. Off goes the owner to Launceston Market with his eyes wide open. But he doesn't find his horse. It's there, of course, but its hair is cut short, its 4 feet are all the same color, and the mark in its ear is a square, not a diamond. The owner doesn't look at it twice. That's simple enough, isn't it?" Mary laughed, in spite of herself. He was so open in his dishonesty that she could not be angry with him. Jim Merlin looked at her seriously, and then he bent towards her, first looking quickly over her head into the door beyond. "Took here," he said. "I'm serious now, you can forget all the nonsense I've told you. Jamaica is no place for a girl, nor for any woman, if it comes to that. Why don't you run away? I could put you on the road to Bodmin." Mary could almost have trusted him. But she could not forget that he was Joss Merlin's brother, and, being that, might deceive her. Time would show whose side he was on. "I don't need any help," she said. "I can look after myself." Jim threw his leg over his horse's back. "All right," he said. "I won't worry you. My house is the other side of Truewater Marsh. I shall be there until the spring, at least. Good day to you." And he was off, and away down the road before she had time to say a word in reply. Mary went slowly back into the house, and the cold, dead air of Jamaica enclosed round her again. Chapter 6. That night the wagons came again. This time they arrived empty, and were loaded with the last of the goods, which had been left at the inn the time before. Mary guessed that this was their way of working. The inn was used as a store for a few weeks at a time, and then, when the opportunity came, the wagons set out once more, and the goods were carried to the riverbank and transported to different places from there. The organization must be a big one, and there would be agents scattered far and wide who kept the necessary watch on events. It was with a sudden sting of disappointment that Mary wondered whether the visit of Jim Merlin to Jamaica in that morning had been important. How strange that the wagons came so soon after him. He had come from Launceston, he said, and Launceston stood on the riverbank. Mary was angry with him and with herself. In spite of everything, her last thought before sleeping had been the possibility of his friendship. She would be a fool if she had hopes of it now. Jim might disagree with his brother, but it was clear that they were both in the same trade. It was a miserable, bad business in every way, and here she was in the middle of it all, with impatience like a child to be looked after. The next few days passed uneventfully. Then there came a fine cold morning when, for a change, the sun shone in a cloudless sky. Mary, whose spirits always rose at the sight of the sun, had turned her morning into a washing day. She felt well, and sang as she worked. Her uncle had ridden away on the moors somewhere, and a sense of freedom possessed her whenever he was away. An urgent knocking at the window made her look up, and she saw Aunt Patience making signs to her, very white in the face and clearly frightened. Mary wiped her hands and ran to the back door of the house. "It's Mr. Bassett from North Hill," Aunt Patience whispered. "I saw him from the window. He's come on horseback, and another gentleman with him." "Oh, my dear, what are we going to do?" Mary thought quickly. She was in a very difficult position. If this Mr. Bassett represented the law, it was her one chance of telling someone about her uncle. She could tell him about the wagons and about everything that she had seen since her arrival. She looked down at the trembling woman at her side. By now, there was a continuous hammering on the door. "Mary, if Mr. Bassett asks you what you know, you won't answer him, will you? I can trust you, can't I? You'll not tell him of the wagons? If any danger came to Joss, I'd kill myself, Mary." There was no argument after that. Mary opened the heavy entrance door. There were two men outside. One had climbed down from his horse, it was he who had rained the blows on the door. The other was still on horseback. His face was brown and heavily lined. Mary judged him to be about 50 years of age. "You don't hurry here, do you?" he called. "There doesn't seem to be much of a welcome for travelers. Is the landlord at home?" "If you please, Mr. Bassett, My husband went out as soon as he had eaten his breakfast, and whether he will be back before night I cannot say. That's a pity. I wanted a word or two with Mr. Joss Merlin. Mr. Bassett climbed heavily to the ground. While I'm here I may as well look round, and I'll tell you here and now it's useless to refuse me. I am a magistrate, and I have the necessary documents. He pushed his way past the two women. And Patience made a movement as though to prevent him, but Mary said quietly, "Let him go. If we try to stop him now we shall only anger him the more." The rooms were thoroughly explored. The magistrate looked into the dusty corners, lifted old bags and boxes, examined the stores of food, all the time crying out in anger and disgust. "Call this in, do you? You haven't even got a bed fit for a cat to sleep on. The place is horrible. What does it mean, eh? Have you lost your tongue, Mrs. Merlin?" The poor woman could not reply, she kept shaking her head and working her mouth, and Mary knew that she was wondering what would happen when they came to the locked room in the passage. "What about you, young woman? Have you anything to say? I'm here to look after my aunt. She's not very strong, you can see that for yourself. She's easily frightened. I don't blame her, living in a place like this. Well, kindly show me the room that has barred windows. I noticed it from the yard, and I'd like to see inside." "I'm very sorry, sir," Mary replied, "but if you mean the old storeroom at the end of the passage, I'm afraid the door is locked. My uncle always keeps the key, and where he puts it I don't know." "Well, that's easily settled. We'll have the door down in no time." He went out into the yard to call his servant. In a few minutes, he returned with his man, Richards, who was carrying an iron bar, which he had found in the stable. For a few minutes, the door bore every blow. Then there was a splitting of wood and a crash, and the door gave way. It was dark, of course, the blocked windows kept the light out. The servant produced a light, and the magistrate stepped into the room. For a moment there was silence as the magistrate turned, letting the light shine in every corner, and then, making sounds of annoyance and disappointment, he faced the little group behind him. "Nothing," he said, "nothing at all. The landlord has made a fool of me again. Except for a pile of empty bags in one corner, there was nothing in the room. It was thick with dust. There was no furniture of any sort. The fireplace had been blocked up with stones and the floor itself was of stone like the passage outside. On top of the bags lay a length of twisted rope." Then the magistrate turned once more into the passage. "Well, Mr. Joss Merlin has won this time. I'll admit myself beaten. Now listen to me," he said, pointing his whip at Mary. This aunt of yours may have lost her tongue, but you can understand plain English, I hope. Do you mean to tell me you know nothing of your uncle's business? Does nobody ever call here, by day or night? Mary looked him straight in the eye. I've never seen anyone, she said. Have you ever looked into that locked room before today? No. Have you any idea why he should keep it locked up? No, none at all. Have you ever heard wheels in the yard by night? I'm a very heavy sleeper. Nothing ever wakes me? Where does your uncle go when he's away from home? I don't know. Don't you think it's very strange, to keep an inn on the main road and then to close your door to every traveler? My uncle is a very strange man. That is true. In fact, he's so strange that half the people in the countryside won't sleep quietly in their beds until he's been hanged, like his father before him. You can tell him that from me. He climbed onto his horse. One other thing, he called. Have you seen anything of your uncle's younger brother, Jim Merlin, of Truwaerta? No, said Mary steadily. He never comes here. Oh, doesn't he? Well, that's all I want from you this morning. Good day to you both. And away the two men went from the yard, and so on to the road. Jos Merlin returned just before midday. Mary told him calmly what had happened during the morning. He swore and shouted, but he was frightened, she could see that, and his confidence was shaken. Get me something to eat, he said. I must go out again, and there's no time to waste. You've done well today, Mary, and I'll not forget it. She looked him in the eyes. You don't think I did it for you, do you? I don't care why you did it, the result's the same. As soon as he had finished his meal, the landlord rose to his feet and left the kitchen. Mary watched him cross the moor. She thought for a moment, doubting the wisdom of the sudden plan in her head, and then she ran down the field after her uncle. When she reached the bottom, she bent down beside the stone wall until his figure crossed the skyline and disappeared, and then she jumped up again and followed him, picking her way across the rough grass and stones. It was crazy, no doubt, but her idea was to keep Jos Merlin in view, and in this way to learn something of his secret plan. After a few miles, she realized how difficult it was. She had to keep a good distance between them in order to remain unseen, and the landlord walked at such a speed that before long she saw that she would be left behind. The ground was now soft beneath her feet. The whole of the low-lying plain ahead of her was wet with winter rains. Her uncle had crossed the worst of the low ground with the quickness given by many years of practice. Then he was hidden by a big rock and she saw him no more. It was impossible to discover the path, which he had taken across the marsh, but Mary followed as best she could. She was a fool to attempt it, she knew, but a sort of determined stupidity made her continue. When she reached the top of the hill, the evening clouds were thick and the world was gray. The horizon was hidden. Mary would never find her uncle now. She knew herself to be a fool for having gone so far on a December afternoon. Experience had proved to her that when darkness came on Bodmin Moor it was sudden and without warning. The low cloud over the marshes was dangerous too. But there was less danger from the marshes if she kept to the high ground, so, pulling up her skirt, she walked steadily forward, feeling the ground with some care when in doubt, and avoiding those places where the grass felt soft and gave way under her feet. Her legs were heavy, and her feet felt as if they hardly belonged to her, and her eyes felt sunken away back in her head. She walked on, her head low and her hands at her side, thinking that the tall gray chimneys of Jamaica Inn would be, for the first time, a welcome sight. The path was wider now, and was crossed by another running from left to right, and Mary stood uncertainly for a few moments, wondering which to take. It was then that she heard the sound of a horse coming out of the darkness to the left. Mary waited in the middle of the track, and after some time the horse appeared out of the low cloud in front of her. The horseman turned sharply to the side as he saw Mary, and stopped. "Hello," he cried, "who's there? Is anyone in trouble?" Then, looking down closely, he said in surprise, "A woman. What in the world are you doing out here? Can you help me to find the road? I'm miles from home and hopelessly lost. Steady there," he said to his horse. "Stand still, will you? Where have you come from?" "Of course I will help you if I can." His voice was low and gentle. "I live at Jamaica Inn," she said, and as soon as the words were out of her mouth, she wished she had not said them. For a moment, the man was silent, but when he spoke again his voice had not changed, but was quiet and gentle as before. "Jamaica Inn?" he said. "You've come a long way in the wrong direction, I'm afraid. You're tired out. You're not fit to walk another step, and what's more, I'm not going to let you. We're not far from the village, and you shall ride there. You shall come home with me, and dry your clothes and rest a little and have some supper before I take you back myself to Jamaica Inn." He spoke with such kindness, but with such firmness, that Mary trusted him. Then she saw his eyes for the first time beneath the edge of his hat. They were strange eyes, like glass, and so pale in color that they seemed near to white. His hair was white, too, under his black hat, and Mary looked at him in some surprise, because his face was lined and his voice was not that of an old man. Then, with sudden embarrassment, she understood, and she turned away her eyes. He was an albino. He took off his hat. "Perhaps I had better introduce myself," he said with a smile. Even if the meeting is unusual, it is the right thing to do, I believe. My name is Frances Davy, and I am the vicar of Orphan. Chapter 7. There was something strangely peaceful about his house. Mary stretched out her hands towards the fire. The silence pleased her, it took away her fear. She watched Frances Davy as he laid the table for supper. "Hannah lives in the village," he said. "She leaves every afternoon at 4. I prefer to be by myself. I like getting my own supper, and then I can choose my own time." She had not yet become used to his white hair and his eyes, his black clothes made them even more noticeable. She was tired, but she swallowed her supper. He poured her out a steaming cup of tea. Now and again, she took a quick look at him, but he seemed to sense it immediately, for he would turn, his eyes on her with their cold white look, like that of a blind man, and she would look away again. The warmth of the room and the hot tea made her sleepy, and his gentle voice came from far away. "Why were you wandering on the moor tonight?" Hardly knowing how it happened, she heard her voice reply to his. "I'm in terrible trouble," she said. "Sometimes I think I shall become like my aunt, and go out of my mind. I've not been at Jamaica in much more than a month, but it seems like 20 years. It's my aunt that worries me, if only I could take her away. But she won't leave Uncle Joss, in spite of his treatment of her. Every night when I go to bed I wonder if I shall wake up and hear the wagons. The first time they came, there were 6 or 7 of them, and they brought great packages and boxes that the men stored in the locked room at the end of the passage. A man was killed that night. I saw the rope hanging from a beam downstairs." She stopped, the warm color flooding her face. "I've never told anyone before. It had to come out. I couldn't keep it to myself any longer. I've done something terrible." For a moment or two, he did not answer, then he spoke gently and slowly. "Don't be afraid. Your secret is safe, no one shall know of this but me. When you have rested, I'll take you back, and I'll make your excuses to the landlord if you wish." "Oh, you mustn't do that," said Mary quickly. "If he suspects half of what I've done tonight he would kill me and you too. You don't understand. He's a violent man, and nothing would stop him. Isn't your imagination running away with you a little?" said the vicar. "This is the 19th century, you know, and men don't murder one another without reason. Having gone so far, don't you think you had better let me hear the rest of your story? What is your name, and why are you living at Jamaica Inn?" Mary looked up at the pale eyes in the colorless face, at his white hair, and she thought again how strange he was, this man who might be 21, who might be 60, and who with his soft voice could persuade her to admit every secret she possessed if he wanted. She could trust him, that, at least, was certain. The first part of her story was told in short and broken sentences, beginning with that first Saturday night at the bar, and then working backwards to her arrival at the inn. Her report did not sound true, even to her who knew the truth of it, and she was so tired that she often could not find the words, but paused for thought and then went back in her story and repeated herself. He heard her to the end with patience, but all the time she felt his eyes watching her, and he had a habit of swallowing from time to time, which she came to recognize, and wait for. When she had finished, the vicar got up from his chair and began to walk around the room. "I believe you, of course," he said, after a moment or so, "but your story wouldn't be believed in a court of law. And another thing, it's wrong, we all know that, but smuggling goes on all over the country, and half the magistrates make a profit out of it. That shocks you, doesn't it? But you can be sure that it's the truth. I have met Mr. Bassett once or twice, and I believe him to be an honest sort of man, but between ourselves, a bit of a fool. I can tell you one thing, though, his visit will have frightened your uncle. There won't be any more wagons to Jamaica in for some time, I think you can be certain of that. If I were you, I should just wait. Keep a close watch on your uncle, and when the wagons do come again you can tell me immediately. We can then decide together what should be done. What about the stranger who disappeared? He was murdered, I'm certain of that. Do you mean to say that nothing can ever be done about it? I'm afraid not, unless his body is found, which is extremely unlikely, said the vicar. In fact, it's quite possible that he was never killed at all. Forgive me, but I think you allowed your imagination to run away with you over that. All you saw was a piece of rope, remember. If you had actually seen the man dead, or even wounded, well, that would be a different matter. I heard my uncle threaten him. Isn't that enough? My dear child, people threaten one another every day of the year, but they don't hang for it. Now listen to me. I am your friend, and you can trust me. If you ever become worried or frightened, I want you to come and tell me about it. Algernon is only a few miles by the road. That's agreed between us, isn't it? Thank you very much. And now I'm going to drive you back to Jamaica Inn. The thought of returning was hateful to Mary, but it had to be faced. The night was fine. The dark clouds of the early evening had passed away, and the sky was bright with stars. It was a strange, exciting drive. The wind blew in Mary's face. The horse thundered along the hard white road, and the vicar made no attempt to control it. Mary saw that he was smiling. Go on, he urged the animal, go on, You can go faster than this," and his voice was low and excited, as if he were talking to himself. The effect was unnatural. Mary felt as if he were in another world and had forgotten her existence. He looked like a bird, bending forward in his seat, with his clothes blown by the wind. His arms were like wings. He might be any age. Then he smiled down at her, and was human again. "I love these moors," he said. "If you knew them as well as I do, and had seen them in every type of weather, winter and summer, you would love them too. They go back a long way in time. Sometimes I think that they have lived on from another age. The moors were the first things to be made, afterwards came the forests and the valleys and the sea." Already Mary could see the tall chimneys of Jamaica in against the sky. The drive was ended, and the excitement left her. The old fear and hatred of her uncle returned. The vicar stopped his horse just before the yard, beside a grassy bank. "There's no sign of anyone," he said quietly. "It's like a house of the dead. I'm going to look in at the window." She watched him go to the side of the house and he stood there for a few minutes looking. Then he made a sign to her to follow. "There'll be no argument tonight with the landlord of Jamaica Inn." Mary followed the direction of his eyes and came forward to the window. Jos Merlin sat at the table unconscious, his great legs stretched out on either side of him, his hat on the back of his head. He looked straight in front of him at the light, his eyes fixed like those of a dead man. A bottle lay with its neck broken on the table, and beside it an empty glass. The fire had burned away to nothing. Francis Davy pointed to the door. "You can walk inside and go upstairs to bed. Your uncle will not even see you. Good night to you, Mary Ellen. If you're ever in trouble and need me, I shall be waiting for you at Algernon." Then he turned the corner of the house and was gone.